He always called her by her last name, like a soldier keeping his distance to protect his own skin and his own heart. But there was something in the way he pronounced those syllables, a weight hidden between orders and reports, as if each letter were a wall erected against a forbidden feeling. In the barracks, discipline was law, and any slip-up could cost not only their ranks, but their reputation, their trust, the life they had both built. Yet in the silence of certain corridors, when their eyes met for a second longer than permitted, an invisible thread burned between them. And it was on a stormy night, when the sound of rain drowned out everything, that he dared to break his own rule and whispered her first name, not like an officer summoning a subordinate, but like a man risking everything for a moment of truth. The sound pierced the air like a silent confession, charged with a desire that could never be written down in reports. She froze, her heart racing, knowing that in that single gesture held both danger and promise. The empty corridor became a minefield, where every breath could be her last before the inevitable explosion. And what came after that whisper would change not only their fate, but the course of the entire base. If this story has already caught your attention, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the rest. The military base slept in the rain. Security lights streaked across the courtyard like cold headlights, illuminating only fragments of sodden concrete and shadows that shifted in the wind. Inside, the corridors were long and silent, each step echoing like a reminder of the discipline that governed this place. She walked with impeccable posture, her eyes always ahead, as if knowing that any slip-up, no matter how small, would be recorded and commented on in hushed tones. He, on the other hand, had a rigidity etched in his gaze, a man trained not to yield, to maintain distances that protected not only his career, but also the secrets he carried close to his chest. From day one, he had called her only by her last name. There had never been an exception, not even off-duty. It was as if that detail were his armor, the last barrier against something he didn't want or couldn't face. But deep down, there was a weight to that caution. He could hear the way her name stuck in his throat, as if a part of him wanted to shape it differently, closer, more intimate. She felt it too. Try as she might to ignore it, there was a moment at the end of every conversation when their eyes met for a second longer than etiquette allowed. It was in this silent space that something dangerous grew. There was nothing explicit, no exchange of words that could be used against them, but the air changed. It was thick, charged with a tension that didn't dissipate even on the most difficult missions. And that night, with the sound of rain blanketing the world, she knew something was about to break. She didn't yet know if it was discipline or her own heart, but the entire base seemed to breathe differently. And deep down, she feared and longed to find out what would happen if that wall he'd built so carefully finally crumbled. The storm relentlessly awoke that morning, and the base awoke to generators rumbling like trapped beasts. The courtyard was puddled, reflecting the sodden flags, and the smell of burnt coffee filled the main corridor as the day's first orders mingled with the metallic clang of the doors. She arrived early, hurriedly tied up her hair, and crossed the lobby with her briefcase clutched to her chest as if holding a secret. He was already there, punctual as a clock that refuses to be late, lining up reports, initialing pages, avoiding any glance that lingered beyond protocol. Her last name fell from her lips with the precise tone of discipline, a sound clean, without edges, yet sharp as a nail. She responded with an impeccable, "Sir," but inside she felt the cold iron of distance. It was easy to obey orders, hard to ignore the part of her heart that already recognized him by his step, by the silence between one sentence and the next, by the shadow he cast when he paused before the map on the wall. That week, the base was expecting a surprise inspection. Rumors of leaked procedures circled like blackbirds, landing on the shoulders of anyone with a moment's distraction. The regulations on inappropriate relationships were printed and reposted on the bulletin board, as if someone wanted to remind her that inside, love wasn't a subject of review. Captain Hargrove, a man who rarely smiled and never lowered his voice, found a minor error in her report, a time difference, an irrelevant detail that didn't alter any procedure. Even so, he made her reread the passage in front of everyone, underlining each word like a verdict. She swallowed the humiliation with the dignity of someone who knows her own name isn't an apology. He watched without moving a muscle, and his silence was a splinter that stuck in her throat. Later, the rain thickened and the lights flickered. In the communications center, the screen turned her face blue, revealing the dark circles under her eyes, as if she'd learned to sleep with one eye open. He entered without knocking, and the sound of the door closing seemed to shut out the outside world. On the table, an open file exposed a corner of her badge. Her first name, short, impossible to read without a warm feeling in her chest. He averted his eyes like someone rejecting a glass of water in the desert. He talked about the inspection, about deadlines, about being careful with words that could be taken out of context. She heard it all, and for a second she thought his voice was trembling, a near fissure in the wall. When he finished, she took a deep breath and thanked him. Then a crack sounded in the ceiling, the light wavering, and they were both trapped in a second long enough for the truth to peek through. He composed himself first and called her by her last name again. She smiled, a tired smile, and said she understood. "In here, names become uniforms," she said, almost like a lame joke. He wanted to respond with something that would soften the harshness, but he didn't. At the end of the workday, an anonymous email landed in the audit inbox, a report of inappropriate proximity between a superior and a subordinate, attaching times they were seen in the same hallway, trivial details piled up like bricks. The message pinged across too many screens, and the rumor took hold before lunch the next day. She read it and felt the ground give way an inch beneath her boots. There was nothing to hide, but nothingness was exactly the kind of thing evil chooses to embellish. He received the copy with an impassive face, but his fingers trembled enough to stain the last signature of the day with ink. Hargrove brushed past him with a caustic comment about sticking to the right names. In the cafeteria, low conversations broke as she entered, and for the first time the surname that had always been a wall turned to stone. She didn't ask him to defend her. She knew any gesture from him would be gasoline on the fire. But as they crossed the corridor leading to the service stairs, she stopped halfway, as if daring to draw an invisible line on the floor. She asked quietly if he'd seen the email. He said yes, and that everything would be investigated as per protocol. She nodded, and for a moment she thought he'd say her first name as an antidote, a warm trench in the cold. He didn't. He called her by her last name once more, and continued on. The next night, the storm subsided, but the base remained charged. As she turned off the lights in the communications center, she noticed something stuck under the keyboard, a piece of clear, barely visible tape. Beneath it, an old newspaper clipping with a woman's name underlined, and it wasn't hers. She didn't know if it was chance, an oversight, or a clue. She only knew that, in that place where everything has codes and stamps, someone was using names as weapons, and that if the whisper of that first name ever came, it wouldn't be out of sweetness. It would be out of necessity, like someone calling the soul back from the fire. Dawn arrived with a cold that seemed to penetrate the walls. The generator hummed erratically, and the distant sound of helicopter blades cut through the heavy silence. She was alone in the file room, reorganizing old boxes as protocol required before the inspection. The air smelled of damp paper and forgotten dust, and each click of the filing cabinet seemed louder than it should have been. The door creaked slowly, and he entered. There was no report in his hands, no commanding expression on his face, just a look charged with something she couldn't immediately decipher. They stood motionless for a few seconds, as if their very presence were enough to create an electric tension in the air. He approached, letting the sound of his boots echo between the narrow shelves. He spoke softly, almost in a whisper that wasn't an order, nor a warning, but also wasn't a confession. He said they'd found another complaint, this time with dates and locations that could be interpreted in dangerous ways. She asked if any names were involved. He hesitated. That silence was more eloquent than any sentence, and she understood that there were. His, hers. Her name for the first time, not as a signature of duties fulfilled, but as a target. Distant thunder rumbled, and for a moment the lights flickered, casting long shadows that moved like ghosts across the floor. She felt the urge to say she didn't care, that she didn't care what they might invent, but she knew nothing was simple here. He took a step closer, and his scent mingled with the aged paper. Then, with a calm that seemed calculated, he said, "Here, any misplaced word can become a sentence." He didn't need to say anything else. The implication was that if he ever called her by her first name, it wouldn't be in the heat of a stolen moment, but in the face of something irrevocable, like a final act. She held his gaze steady, even as her breath quickened. Before he left a sealed manila envelope on the table. He didn't explain, didn't ask for a signature, just slid the paper inside and told her to keep it. As soon as he walked through the door, she carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet, with a clipping from a list of soldiers from 10 years ago. Her name wasn't there, but his was, next to another female surname she'd never heard, and scrawled by hand was a first name underlined twice. She couldn't tell if it was a warning, a reminder, or a promise, but she understood that whatever it meant, she was closer to the breaking point than she had ever been. The next day dawned grey, the kind of light that makes everything colder and more impersonal. The cafeteria was quieter than usual, as if conversations had migrated to more discreet corridors. She entered with firm steps, ignoring the quick glances from distant tables. She knew that after the second email of accusation, any movement would be interpreted as evidence or provocation. She grabbed her coffee, sat alone and kept her eyes fixed on the window, observing the drenched courtyard. As she lifted her cup, she felt a shiver, not from the cold, but from realization. He was there across the room speaking to Captain Hargrove. She didn't need to hear to understand the matter was serious. His rigid posture, his clenched jaw, and the way his hands were clenched, almost into fists, betrayed more than any report could ever write. Minutes later, he crossed the cafeteria without looking either way, but as he passed her, he discreetly dropped a folded piece of paper. It was quick enough not to attract attention, but too calculated to be an accident. She waited a few seconds before picking it up. Opening it, she found a single sentence: "Don't go out alone tonight, and don't trust anyone who uses your full name." Her heart raced. It wasn't paranoia, it was warning, and coming from him, it sounded like a sentence. The shift dragged on, and the base seemed to have eyes on every corner. 2 security sergeants were seen prowling areas not their responsibility, and rumors of an internal cleansing began to surface. By the time the sun set, she knew obeying the order would be harder than it seemed. She needed to go to the auxiliary storage room to retrieve old documents to finish a report. Officially, no one could question her. Unofficially, she was moving away from the surveillance center. The hallway leading to the warehouse was nearly dark, the lamps burned out, and the echo of each footstep seemed louder than it should have been. At the end, before the metal door, she noticed a silhouette leaning against the wall. It wasn't him. His face was partially obscured by his military cap, but his tone of voice left no doubt. It wasn't someone who had come to help. "Your name is on the lips of dangerous people," the man said, approaching, "and when your name is on the line, it's best to know who's speaking it." She tried to remain calm, but her fingers clenched tightly around the sheaf of papers she carried. The man leaned in slightly, as if gauging her reaction. Then, without warning, he tossed an envelope on the floor and left without looking back. She didn't want to open it there. She returned to her dorm, locked the door, and only then tore open the seal. Inside was an old photograph. Him, younger, next to a woman she'd never seen, but whose first name was written on the back, accompanied by a note. Some names stay with you forever, others cost everything. In that moment, she understood that what was happening wasn't just internal intrigue. It was a dispute where names were used as weapons, and where the simple act of speaking them could change destinies. And perhaps hers was about to be spoken, in the most dangerous way possible. The night seemed longer than any other. The room was silent, but that silence didn't bring rest. It was the kind of stillness that precedes something inevitable. She lay in her uniform, boots still on, listening to every creak of the building as if it were footsteps. The envelope with the photograph still lay open on the table, and the name on the back seemed to pulse in the darkness, as if it might find a voice at any moment. She tried to push away the image of him beside that unknown woman, but her mind insisted on concocting hypotheses that ranged from forgotten memories to dangerous alliances. Around midnight, a metallic noise in the hallway made her get up. She slowly opened the door and saw that at the end of the hall, someone had left a black folder leaning against the wall. No one was around. She walked over to it, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw her own name written on the label in red letters. Opening it, she found copies of reports from missions she had never been on, all signed with her last name. And next to each document were notes in masculine handwriting as if in a diary. She doesn't know anything yet. Before she could process what she was seeing, she felt movement behind her. She turned quickly and found him standing there, motionless, as if he'd appeared out of nowhere. His gaze wasn't that of a disgruntled superior or a worried ally. It was that of someone who knew they were about to cross a line of no return. He took the folder from her hands, slammed it shut and said simply, "You have to trust me even if you don't understand. This base has ghosts who use names to erase people." The tone wasn't metaphorical. It was a warning. Without waiting for an answer, he walked away carrying his briefcase and entered the service stairs. She stood there breathing fast, realizing that with each new piece of furniture that appeared, she became less aware of her footing. Returning to her room, she found a folded piece of paper under her pillow. She recognized his handwriting. The note read, "If I ever say your first name, run. Don't look back." Sleeping after that was impossible. She spent the rest of the night sitting on the edge of her bed, replaying every encounter, every conversation, every time he'd uttered her last name like a shield. Now she understood that that barrier wasn't just discipline, it was protection. But protection from what? And more importantly, from whom? The next morning, as she left for her shift, she found Captain Hargrove waiting at the door. He watched her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and said slowly, as if savoring the moment, "Curious, I heard a whisper last night. Your first name, and it came from a place you won't like to hear." The hallway seemed narrower as she passed Hargrove. His smile still hung heavy in the air like a sharp blade, hinting he knew more than he was letting on. Each step toward the communications room sounded hollow, and the feeling of being followed grew, even without audible footsteps behind her. Entering, she closed the door and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. The computer was already on, but she hadn't been the one to activate it. On the screen, an email with no sender, just one line. "First names are no longer secrets. Choose your loyalties wisely." Her blood ran cold. It wasn't just the invasion of privacy. It was the implicit message that the noose was tightening. In the reflection of the screen, she noticed a shadow behind her. She turned quickly, and there he was, standing there holding a crumpled envelope. Without explaining, he placed it on the table and said, "They want you to doubt me." She opened them and found photos of her taken from afar, leaving the dorm, in the cafeteria, in meetings, all marked with precise times and dates. In the corner of some, scribbles indicated, "Moment of vulnerability." He looked tired, as if he'd been suffering from sleepless nights. He said the web of intrigue within the base wasn't limited to gossip, but also involved manipulating reputations to pave the way for strategic promotions. And when your name enters this game, you cease to be a person and become a bargaining chip. She asked if the name on the back of the old photo, the woman next to him, was part of this same game. He looked away, and that silence hurt more than any answer. Before they could say anything else, the base's public address system erupted with a general announcement, a surprise inspection at dawn. Hargrove's voice echoed over the loudspeaker, announcing that any absence would be considered insubordination. He gave her a look that was a mix of warning and dismissal. "Don't go alone. And if you need to, remember what I told you about your first name." Dawn crept in like a predator. The courtyard was overly lit, almost blinding, and soldiers moved in tense ranks. During the inspection, Hargrove made a point of approaching her. He murmured something only she heard. "Names are like keys. Yours is in my hand now." It was at that moment that she realized she was trapped not just by military protocol, but by a power game where every word spoken could be her last. The dawn dragged on under the weight of gazes that didn't meet by chance. The courtyard was filled with an almost palpable tension, as if everyone there knew the inspection was less about order and more about observing reactions. She maintained her impeccable posture, her hands firmly at her sides, but inside she could feel her heart hammering against her uniform. Every time Hargrove passed by, it was as if the air grew thicker, as if he took pleasure in prolonging this state of alert. At the end of the search, the group was dismissed, except for a few names who were supposed to report to the meeting room for special instructions. Hers was on the list. His was too. They walked together down the narrow corridor, without exchanging a single word, but their proximity was enough for her to notice his rapid breathing. Upon entering, she found the room dimly lit, with only a single lamp hanging over the central table. Hargrove was already there, with an open briefcase and a controlled smile. He began talking about conduct and discipline, but it was clear each sentence had a specific target. He tossed a report on the table that described, in detail, unofficial meetings between her and the officer standing next to her. The narrative was distorted, constructed to imply intimacy where there was only work, and perhaps something more, which neither of them dared admit aloud. She felt heat rise to her face, but before she could say anything, he stepped forward. He said firmly that every accusation there was fabricated, that it was a pattern used against soldiers who threatened certain interests within the base. Hargrove smiled, as if expecting exactly that reaction. Interesting. Because I heard you using her first name with my own ears yesterday. What do you think that means, officer? The silence that followed was piercing. She turned to him, expecting a denial, an explanation, anything. But he just kept his gaze fixed on her, and in that instant she understood that, yes, he had said it, and that the meaning went far beyond what Hargrove could imagine. The captain continued. Names carry weight, and when a man like you decides to use them, the consequences can be definitive. He didn't answer. He just took a step forward, closer to her, until he could speak quietly enough for only her to hear. His lip almost formed the first letter, but he stopped, closing his mouth as if holding back a secret on the verge of escaping. Hargrove watched eagerly, waiting for the moment to fall. She understood that if he finished that word, something would break irreversibly, not just for them, but for everything they had protected until then. The meeting room door closed with a sharp click, muffling the distant sound of rain against the metal roof. Only the three of them remained, she, he, and Hargrove, who now seemed more like a spectator than a superior, someone waiting for the exact moment the rope would snap. The captain turned, walking slowly around the table, letting the echo of his boots set the pace for what sounded like an unofficial interrogation. On the tabletop, the files remained laid out, each page a calculated attack, each sentence an attempt to turn insinuation into evidence. He remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the lamp swaying gently above the table, as if measuring the distance between the present moment and the breaking point. She knew that if he wanted to, he could dismantle every accusation there, expose the twisted logic, reveal the true culprits. But something in him hesitated, not out of fear, but because he understood that sometimes the truth, spoken at the wrong moment, can destroy more quickly than a well-planned lie. Hargrove, impatient, stopped behind her and spoke with the coldness of someone who knows every vulnerable point of his enemy. I've seen men lose everything for less. All it takes is one misplaced word. A name, for example. The provocation was clear. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table, and stared at her with a look that seemed to pierce her. Then, in a barely perceptible tone, he began to form the first syllable of her name. The sound was low, almost a whisper, but carried a weight that made her heart race. She realized in that instant that it wasn't just restrained affection or a line of command. There was something deeper, perhaps a silent pact between them, something no military regulations could convey. Before the word could be finished, Hargrove interrupted, slamming his hand down on the table as if trying to break the spell. Interesting. It seems you know more than you're willing to admit. He took a step back, straightening, and the moment vanished like smoke. But for her, that near utterance was like a trigger, a reminder that his protectiveness had a limit, and that once she crossed that line, there would be no going back. As she left the room, she realized they were no longer just playing with reputations. They were dealing with something that could cost much more than rank or position. And the feeling that their next encounter would be decisive followed her down the hallway like a shadow clinging to her skin. The base fell into an eerie silence that night, a silence that came not from the absence of sound, but from its containment. Footsteps were shorter, conversations quieter, as if even the wind feared carrying certain words. She left her barracks to work an extra shift in the communications center, but the feeling of being followed wouldn't leave her. Every reflection in the dark windows seemed to carry a shadow that belonged to no one visible. Upon entering the room, he found the light already on. On the table, an unmarked envelope. Instinct told him not to touch it, but curiosity won out. Inside, there was only a sheet of paper with a handwritten sentence. "When he says your first name, it will be too late." The handwriting wasn't his, nor Hargrove's, but it carried an almost military precision, as if wanting to be clear and definitive. While she was still processing, she heard a dull noise in the hallway, something between a stumble and a controlled fall. She opened the door and saw, a few feet away, two men she didn't recognize, wearing uniforms without insignia. One of them held a notepad with her last name written repeatedly on it. The other spoke into the radio, citing coordinates and times that coincided with her routine. Realizing she was being watched, they dispersed too quickly for it to be a coincidence. When she returned to the room, he was there, leaning against the wall, his arms crossed and his gaze fixed on her. He said nothing for a few seconds, and in that silence, something burned in the air. He approached and placed a small, scratched, heavy metal box on the table. "Open it when you have no other choice," he said, his tone leaving no room for questions. Before leaving, he added too quietly for any camera to capture, "If anyone says your first name before me, run. And don't look back." A chill ran down her spine like a cut. It was no longer just intrigue or a veiled threat. A hunt was underway, and for the first time, she felt that the wall between them, built with discipline and surnames, might crumble not by choice but by survival. Dawn brought with it a biting wind which swept through the courtyard as if trying to tear away the secrets hidden within those walls. The base was nearly deserted, but the lack of movement brought no relief. On the contrary, it made every isolated sound all the more menacing. She walked quickly, the metal box he'd given her tucked inside her coat, feeling its weight as if carrying a concrete piece of a destiny she didn't yet understand. At the intersection of two hallways, she found him waiting, his back to the wall, his expression as hard as ever. There was no exchange of greetings, just a direct look that seemed to say everything without words. "They're moving faster than I anticipated," he said, adjusting the holster on his hip. "If we stay still, they'll use your name to justify what they've already decided to do." He led her along a path that avoided the main cameras, descending a narrow staircase to an old section of the base, where the bricks still bore signs of infiltration and the air smelled of rust. There he pulled from his pocket a small sheaf of documents, all stamped as confidential. He opened it on a rusty table and revealed reports describing embezzlement maneuvers signed by officials who now held high positions. This evidence should never have existed, but it does. And now they want it forgotten, along with those who knew it. She realized then that her name was in the mix because she'd appeared in the wrong place at the wrong time, and perhaps alongside the right person to strike fear into the guilty. "Hargrove has already pressed me twice to confirm that you called me by my first name," he continued gravely. "If I say yes, you're doomed. If I say no, we both are." Before they could decide their next move, a metallic clang echoed down the hallway, coming from the stairs they had descended. Footsteps were quick, firm, belonging to more than one person. He turned off the only hanging light and, in the darkness, took her arm firmly, guiding her to a side door. "No matter what happens, keep the box with you," he whispered. And for the first time, his voice trembled slightly, as if the wall he had built with years of control was beginning to give way. As the door closed behind them, she heard someone say her last name in the hallway, but the sound was laced with mockery, as if it were a prelude to something worse. And then, in the darkness, he leaned in to whisper something in her ear. In the darkness, his breath was so close she could feel the heat escaping between the words still unspoken. For a moment, the world seemed suspended, caught between the possibility of escape and the ultimate fall. His footsteps approached from the other side of the door, slow, as if of someone who already knows exactly where to look. He cupped her face with a firm but non-committal hand and spoke softly, almost in a whisper. "If I tell you now, you'll have to run. There won't be time to think. The metallic sound of a latch being forced cut through the moment. He hesitated, his lips forming the first syllable, and she felt her entire body react, as if that first letter were a trigger stuck for months. But before the word could fully form, a bang echoed down the hallway. Not a gun, but something heavy falling. The footsteps stopped. Muffled voices exchanged quick orders and then drifted away, as if given a signal to retreat. He didn't relax. He continued to stare at her in the darkness, as if recording every feature of her face in case he couldn't see it again. "It's not time yet," he said, taking a step back. "If I use your first name now, we'll have nowhere to go back to." The tension in the air was almost physical, and she realized that the word so weighted with it was more than intimacy. It was a code, perhaps even a life or death sentence. They left through the side door and walked down a narrow hallway that led to an abandoned warehouse. Inside, he turned on a flashlight and pointed it at the metal box still in her hands. "What's in there won't make sense until I say the word. Until then, keep it closed. It's the only thing keeping them from erasing your name, and you with it." She wanted to ask what would happen if someone else called her that, but he simply replied, "You'll know right away. And when you do, it'll hurt." Outside, the base seemed calm again, but it was the calm of a minefield before the first wrong step. And now, more than ever, she felt the moment of hearing that word approaching, and that nothing would be the same after that. The next dawn arrived heavy, as if the air were thick with something invisible. She had barely slept, sitting on the edge of the bed with the metal box on her knees, running her thumb over the cool grooves of the lid. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw his mouth almost forming that forbidden word, and the incomplete sound reverberated in her mind like an echo that would not fade. When her shift began, the atmosphere at the base was different. Soldiers moved too quickly, and orders were given without explanation. Conversations ceased whenever she approached, and calculated glances followed her through the corridors. Hargrove seemed more satisfied than ever, as if he'd received confirmation that the siege was ready to close. As he passed her, he remarked with venom in his voice, "Some doors only open with the right word, and some close forever." In the middle of the afternoon, she was called to a routine meeting in the administrative block. Upon arriving, she found the room dark, lit only by the filtered light from the blinds. On the table were no papers or folders, just a two-way radio, switched on, emitting a low, steady hum. He was there, leaning in the corner, his expression more serious than she had ever seen him. "They're going to try to push my limits today," he said bluntly. "They're going to create the perfect situation to get me to say your name. And if that happens, you'll have no choice but to open the box and do exactly what's inside." She swallowed hard. The radio crackled, and Hargrove's voice filled the room, ordering them both to report immediately to the central courtyard. When they emerged, the sky was heavy with low clouds and a biting wind that scattered dust across the concrete floor. In the center, soldiers formed a semicircle, and in the middle was a table with documents and a camera, streaming everything to a room she couldn't see. Hargrove began his interrogation in front of everyone, listing a list of alleged misconduct. Each accusation was more absurd than the last, but all were constructed to force a reaction from him. "So, officer," Hargrove said with a sharp smile, "in front of all this evidence, can you confirm that this soldier is more than just a surname to you?" The silence was absolute. She could hear the wind passing between the still bodies, feel the weight of expectation from dozens of eyes. He took a step forward, so close that the sound of his breathing mingled with hers. His mouth opened, and she knew. This time, there was no hesitation, no turning back. The first letter escaped like a breath laden with years of restraint. The first letter came out like a blade, slicing through the air, laden with a weight that came not just from affection or broken discipline, but from something deeper, a choice he knew would cost him everything. Around him, the semicircle of soldiers seemed to lean forward, as if they all sensed they were about to witness something forbidden. He pronounced the full name clearly, without trembling. And in that instant, the world seemed to fall silent. The sound struck a chord in her that wasn't just emotional. It was physical. A shiver ran down her spine, her muscles tensing as if the word were a code activating something that had been dormant. She felt the weight of the metal box she still carried, and as if guided by instinct, knelt down and opened the seal. Inside was a small device with a red button and a sheaf of documents protected by plastic. On top, a single handwritten instruction. Hand it over to the Federal Audit Office, protect the right names. Before she could react, a siren blared, cutting through the tension like shattering glass. Soldiers began to move in confusion, while Hargrove advanced furiously. "You just sealed your fate," she said, glaring at him, but the look the officer returned was calm, almost cold. Mine, perhaps. Hers, no. And in that moment, she understood that he had waited all this time to use her name, only when it was the only way to free her from the siege. 2 federal agents walked through the main gate, escorted by external security. Their presence froze the courtyard. She stood with the documents in hand, handing them directly to the men in suits. As they signed for the receipt, one of them gave Hargrove a look that needed no explanation, the kind that portends swift downfalls. The wind had shifted. The weight she carried had shifted. He in turn knew he had crossed the line and that there would be no turning back for his career. But when she looked at him, her expression wasn't one of defeat, but of quiet relief. Karma, subtle and inevitable, fell upon those who built accusations with names, and now each of those false words returned like a blade against the author himself. As she walked away with the agents, she heard her name in the distance, one last time, coming from his voice. It wasn't a code, it wasn't a warning. It was a farewell and a promise. And so if this story has kept you hooked so far, leave a like, comment on what you would have done in her place, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Because sometimes a single name can change your entire destiny.